I'm pleased to invite our next speaker, Kurt Albertson, Principal, Procurement Advisory North America, Practice Lead at the Hackett Group. Kurt is an industry expert in the procurement and finance space with over 25 years of experience in successfully supporting ongoing transformation of procurement organizations across the globe. Today, Kurt will share his thoughts on CPO's Agenda 2023, key issues, priorities, and initiatives.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here. So I'm going to jump in here, and this is going to be highlighting Hackett's signature research that we just put out in the market. And that research we do every year, and it looks forward into the next year, kind of looking at, hey, what is on the mind of the chief procurement officer across the different markets, right? And in that study, we take a look at what are the key issues they're most concerned about, what are they prioritizing, and what initiatives are they undertaking? So without further ado, let's jump into the results. Just a quick overview of me. I'm a principal at the Hackett Group, been in the procurement space for about 30 years. If you're not familiar with Hackett, we're a research consulting-based organization that tends to use a lot of data. So we're going to throw a lot of information at you and quantitative data. Okay, so let's take a look and see what's happening, what's on the minds of the most senior level executives. So we're going to start at kind of that 10,000 foot level, heading into 2023. What are the big concerns from a risk perspective that the most senior level executives at companies are concerned about? And not surprisingly, they are the ones that we've been hearing about as individuals in the news, right? Economic downturn. And or recession, right? That the fear of that on the horizon, or in some areas already kind of affecting us, was stated as the top concern, and 2/3 of companies out there rated it as one of their top and key concerns. And you're seeing reactions to that, right? You know, and in the news, you're hearing, layoffs in certain industries that's spreading into other areas. Again, what we're seeing out there is companies getting ready for, if not already in a recessionary environment, which is kind of a big change from where we've been in the last couple of years. The talent shortage continues on, right? The inability to fill critical roles. We've all heard quite a bit about that, particularly in certain regions and demographic areas. That continues to be a top concern, along with inflation, right? There are some signs of inflation easing, yet is still at levels that we haven't seen in many, many years in most parts of the world. And then finally, supply chain disruptions, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. While there's been some easing in this space, it's still an issue and certainly still hot on the minds of the CPO. Those are things as finance and procurement leaders we face every day. And let's kind of drill down a little bit. And that was at the enterprise level. Let's take a look at what's on the minds of the chief procurement officer and what's happening in the procurement function. I like this slide, particularly this year. It's quite telling, right? It tries to give us an idea of what the work volume or workload increase is going to be in the procurement function. And as you see this year, it's expected in 2023 to be pretty significant. Basically, on average, procurement leaders are saying, we expect to be doing a lot more in 2023. And I think you'll get a sense for that on the next slide when we look at some of their key priorities. But 11%, nearly 11% increase in activity workload is quite a bit. Now, the good news is, if you look at kind of procurement staff additions and growth in 2023 and the operating budget, we actually see some positive investment. And, 3% or about 3% may not look like a lot, particularly in face of that 11% increase. But if you look back over the last, 2-3 years, it's usually been pretty flat, right? So even a 3% increase is pretty significant. And then you see on the right-hand side, right, this continued focus on digital transformation, right? Nearly 6% increase investment in the procurement digital transformation strategy. And that's a trend we've been seeing for many years now, right? This continued investment. And obviously that is the antidote to this productivity gap and efficiency gap, right? Leveraging technology is why we're all on these digital transformation journeys, is Work's getting more, we're having to do more. We're not making, investment isn't quite keeping it up from a resource perspective. We're really having to, implement that technology and get that labor swap. And we'll talk more about that. So this is the top priorities, right? This is kind of those, what's on the minds. If I'm a chief procurement officer, what am I most concerned about? What are my priorities in, the coming year? And I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's some things that are certainly worth highlighting. And I think kind of going back to that previous slide, that 11% increase in activity and volume, doing more. There's a reason for that. If you look at some of the things that are on this list, they weren't there 3 years ago, and they haven't been there for quite some time. So the first one, ensuring supply continuity. We saw that as an enterprise objective still. That is number one again. It was number one last year. To some extent, I think there's a little bit of kind of, this was such a big issue last year that, procurement, supply chain leaders were having to manage, finance leaders were having to work through. That it continues to be front and center, even though I think across the board, from what we're hearing out in the market and what from some of our data says, there has been some easing here. Some of this, tightness of supply has certainly eased, but there still are point areas or certain categories or certain supply markets that are tight, right? And we're still running into some of these supply chain risk issues from a continuity perspective. Number two, combating inflationary price increases. We weren't even talking about this, 2 years ago, and not much last year, obviously. So this is, and this hasn't been something, at least in kind of most of the regions. Certainly, some regions have been, having to combat inflationary pressures for a while. But for most, like the U.S. region and a lot across Europe, this has not been something that procurement has been faced with, or the organization has been faced with. So we've been very busy, obviously, kind of pushing back on record price increases coming from supply, trying to protect margins. And while we're seeing some easing of that, certainly in certain demographics across the world, it's still at significant levels, and we're still having to combat those supplier price increases that are being pushed on us. And then number three, right, the traditional value proposition of procurement around spend cost reduction. This certainly hasn't gone away. And is going to, in our opinion, going to even become more important, particularly as we kind of enter into that number one risk concern that we saw in the previous slides of a senior level executives. How do we do it? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But there's one other area I kind of wanted to highlight here, which is pretty important. Number 10, this idea of responsible procurement. This is about sustainability, right? Sustainable green supply chains. This had actually jumped up into the top 5 last year. We expected it to slip a little bit this year, but it's still a top 10 priority. So think, and this hasn't been something we've seen in the top 10 until recent years, particularly in North America. Europe and other parts of the world have been a little more, have rated it higher in the past. But if you think about the challenge, looking at number 1, 2, and 3, and 10, for procurement leaders, there's a lot. These are interesting times like we've never really seen, right? Assuring supply in a market where we're still running into supply issues in terms of continuity, having to manage inflation and beat back inflation as suppliers continue to try to push prices, moving into a recessionary environment. So we better not take our eyes off the all-important spend cost reduction that we're tasked with, while creating not only a more green and sustainable supply base, but also a more diverse supply base in many cases. This is a big ask for procurement, and it's really what is driving, that 11% activity increase that we saw on the previous slide. Now, it's a big task. There's a lot of things we're going to have to do as procurement leaders to address that. But number 4 and 5 on this list start to get at it, right? When we kind of entered into the pandemic and post-pandemic and moving into this inflation and then moving into kind of a recessionary environment, or at least the fear of a recessionary environment, Hackett, we've been very clear about you cannot take your foot off the gas pedal when it comes to your digital transformation journeys, right? And we define digital transformation as a little bit broader than just technology, but technology is a core component of it, obviously. But so is the advanced analytics. How are we leveraging data, big data, and not just for historical spend analysis, but also looking forward and getting predictive, using more, using more AI type based information, kind of bringing together external information from supply markets and what's happening in general, from internal information, and making sense of that, and really having engaging with discussions with stakeholders and being predictive about what we expect to happen and how this is going to impact our business partners. And if you look at 7, 8, and 9, these kind of all get at the same thing, right? Strategic advisor to our business stakeholders. We want to be viewed more strategic in their eyes and influenced to a greater degree. Stakeholder centricity. Look, it's about putting the stakeholder, business problems ahead of our own objectives, and then responding quickly, like adapting to changes and being responsive to our stakeholders. This is all about alignment with our internal stakeholders and being a better partner to them. And then certainly number 6, this broader third-party risk management, cybersecurity, those types of things. We haven't taken our eye off that. So a very full plate for procurement right now. And I would argue in my 30 years in the procurement space, a very unique environment that we really haven't seen before. So it'll be interesting to see how this kind of is managed in 2023. So the last slide was kind of what is on the mind and what is the priorities. This slide really looks at, well, what are the transformation initiatives that procurement is undertaking to deliver on those priorities and the enterprise objectives. There's a lot on this slide. I could talk for hours on this one slide, but the takeaway from it is, there's certain things up in the upper right-hand corner, right? This slide going from left to right, we really, what senior procurement leaders are telling us is the things, the initiatives, the transformation programs that we have on the right-hand side, those are the ones that are really important to helping us achieve those priorities. And as we go from top to bottom, the maturity of these initiatives or capabilities, they say, is more mature, right? So something like strategic sourcing, workhorse of procurement organizations, been around for a very long time, is up in that upper right-hand corner. Very important to achieving those objectives we just talked about, and also a more mature capability. But the interesting thing is if you look at like talent, strategic sourcing, category management, data analytics, and reporting, even though they're up in the upper right-hand corner, more mature, even though they're very important, you also see that the circle is fairly large. And what that means is there's still a lot of transformation underway in those areas. And we see that, right? And it makes sense. Talent, with the turnover numbers that a lot of clients are seeing out there, companies are seeing, particularly in procurement, having to continue to train and upskill resources, getting more value out of things like strategic sourcing and category management. And then, as I talked about, certainly taking data analytics and reporting to the next level, leveraging some of these advanced technologies like AI and big data sets to really kind of help us get to the next level and engage stakeholders. And then you've got the bottom kind of right-hand corner, right, that you see labeled as a critical development area. These are the areas we really need to pay attention to as well, right? These are the areas that, procurement leaders are saying, these are really important, but we're not very mature at them. So, we better be focusing on these if we want to get to where we need to. And here you still see kind of core procurement technology in that critical development area, even though a lot of us have been focused on digital transformation for a very long time. But it goes beyond just having the technology. It's driving the adoption, making sure we have the right ecosystem of technology, figuring out where a suite solution versus kind of some point solutions kind of collaborate and live together in our environment to maximize value. So still quite a bit of activity there. We'll look at this a little bit more detail on one of the next slides. But you see things like supplier relationship management and supplier performance management as still in the critical development area. And it's been there for a while, right? We have to get better at really harnessing the supply base to help align with and engage around our stakeholder objectives throughout the relationship with those suppliers. You still see something like contract management right at the borderline of being a critical development area, which makes sense. There's a lot of opportunity in that CLM space still for a lot of companies, just based on conversations that I've had. And there's a lot going on, right, with smart contracts, leveraging advanced, artificial intelligence to better help support the contracting process and management of those contracts. And then finally, responsible procurement, right? We talked about that. A lot of work. That'll be an interesting area to keep our eye on here in the coming years. Procurement's got a lot of work to address that one. All right. So I've got about a minute or two left here. So I'm going to kind of talk through this. This is the view of the procurement ecosystem from a technology space across that source to pay space, right? And the way we look at the world, right, you've got the upstream technologies around spend analysis, e-sourcing, CLM, and then you've got the downstream kind of what's traditionally called that purchase to pay process. And you see e-procurement to e-payables, supplier onboarding. And then across that layer, and in general, most companies have kind of focused on that end-to-end core procurement technologies and have something in place there in a lot of cases, although a lot of companies are kind of looking at what they've been doing and maybe kind of revisiting that. And then at the top, you've got, okay, what technologies are we using across the life cycle around supply risk, performance management, supplier collaboration, and innovation? Some of those things that drive some of those, capabilities that were in the bottom right-hand corner that I just talked about. So that's still a fairly immature space for a lot of companies. And then at the bottom, you've got some of these supporting emerging technologies, digital solutions like AI, RPA, virtual assistants that we're integrating into our technology environment. Just as a takeaway here, we continue to see, obviously, this migration to the cloud, right? Software as a service as a dominant trend. The other thing we're seeing is really kind of organizations kind of lead with a suite first kind of approach. And when I say suite, a single solution provider across the end-to-end core procurement technology where possible. They really are, but the suite and point solutions really are continuing to outpace the core ERP functionality that a lot of companies used in the past. And what we do from our benchmarking exercises and database that we have, in the procurement space, we've created kind of two groups. There's one group called, that's very advanced from a, process automation, technology adoption perspective. There's another group that is less mature, very, immature with respect to adoption of technology. And then we look at the differences on some of these key metrics. And, not surprisingly, you see on the transactional area, like fewer clerical staff. So leaning out that purchase to pay process, automating transactions like POs and invoicing. We see advantages, right? Although that advantage over time has kind of closed as more and more organizations implement technology. But I think what's very exciting on my end is looking at this data on the effectiveness side, on the business value side. We see still some pretty significant gaps. So those that are out there in front from a digital transformation automation perspective are delivering significantly greater value in areas like higher cost savings, 85% higher for those that have adopted technology to a high degree, 54% less savings lost due to maverick spend, and 78% more likely to be viewed as a valued business partner. So the technology is helping them create a more meaningful, a more deeper relationship with their internal stakeholders. Both based on the fact that it's giving them more time to focus on that, but it's also enabling them with information and better visibility and more real-time access to information. So some big advantages across the efficiency and business value effectiveness side for those that are better at adopting technology. So that's what I had for you today. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Kurt, for the interesting session. Unfortunately, due to the time constraints, we're unable to take any audience questions. However, feel free to catch up with Kurt and other speakers at the networking zone.